Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into some of the most disturbing and twisted medieval punishments you could imagine. Picture yourself, eyes wide, watching as people are strapped into contraptions that would make even the most hardened of criminals cringe. The chilling shrieks of the tortured echo through dark stone chambers, and the faint scent of fear hangs in the air. This isn't some horror movie. It's the harsh reality that was medieval justice. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to post where you're from and what time it is where you are. Let's see who's tuning in from the farthest places tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with one of the most famous, though highly debated, medieval punishments, the Iron Maiden. A device that, even if you've never seen it in real life, you've probably heard of thanks to its appearance in movies and shows. The Iron Maiden was essentially a giant, human-shaped sarcophagus lined with sharp metal spikes. The victim would be placed inside, and the door would shut tight, pushing the spikes into their body. It's said that death wasn't instant, but slow and agonizing. But here's the catch. Historians still argue whether this was actually used during the medieval period or if it was a 19th century creation meant to exaggerate the horrors of the past. Some say it was a fantastic myth created by early museum curators to sensationalize their exhibits. Was the Iron Maiden real, or just a story to scare you as you drift to sleep? One thing's for sure, it captured the imagination of the public, and it remains one of the most enduring images of medieval punishment. People have this morbid fascination with the idea of such an ultimate instrument of torture. But whether it was a true medieval device or not, it certainly fits the bill for a terrifying punishment. So let's shift focus for a moment. Imagine being strapped into a chair, your body immobilized, unable to move. You're forced to stay in a position that you simply cannot escape. Sounds uncomfortable, right? Now, picture this. Your punishment is about to begin. A device known as the breaking wheel is your fate. The wheel, a cruel instrument of execution, wasn't just a metaphor for a poor fortune. It's said that after breaking the bones of a condemned person, they would be tied to the wheel and left to die in agony, often displayed for public viewing. How's that for medieval entertainment? The wheel was supposed to symbolize not just the punishment of the body, but the soul's despair, shattered and left for everyone to witness. Historians still argue whether the wheel was an effective tool for deterring crime, or if it was a tragic spectacle designed to feed the public's thirst for brutality. The method evolved over time. The victim could either be left hanging in a tortured position, or the wheel would rotate, adding even more suffering. The intent wasn't just death. It was the slow, drawn-out process of public humiliation. They wanted everyone to see how horribly someone could be punished for crimes they'd committed. A real-time lesson in justice for the masses. Well, imagine yourself caught in the middle of that. The pain would be unimaginable, right? It was one of the more dignified forms of torture. No quick executions here. You would be left to contemplate your fate, watching as the crowd gathered, some cheering, others grimacing in discomfort. Such a public affair, yet so deeply personal. Now, let's step away from the crowds for a moment. Picture yourself locked away in a dark, damp dungeon where silence hangs heavily in the air. You've been accused of something, perhaps treason or even heresy, and the punishment you're about to face is nothing short of suffocating. The scavenger's daughter was one of the most twisted devices designed to compress the human body, bending it in unnatural ways. Its name might sound innocent enough, but its purpose was anything but. The scavenger's daughter forced the victim into a small, hunched position, legs and head tucked in as they were squeezed between two iron frames. The device was slowly tightened, compressing the victim's body until they couldn't take it anymore. Imagine the crushing pressure building with every turn of the screw. your ribs and lungs straining as the body is contorted further and further. It was said that the victim's bones would snap, their organs slowly suffocated by the immense pressure. The device didn't just inflict pain, it made the very act of breathing feel like a battle. Historians still debate whether this was used as often as records suggest, but it's one of those punishments that, whether real or imagined, captures that gut-wrenching sense of helplessness. But the scavenger's daughter wasn't just about physical pain. The device's slow, methodical nature meant that the victim's suffering stretched over time, creating a psychological toll that would wear them down long before their bodies succumbed to the pressure. It wasn't the immediate, shocking violence of the Iron Maiden or the breaking wheel, but rather the creeping agony of an unrelenting squeeze. If you thought being locked in a chair for a long period of time was uncomfortable, imagine being bound in such a painful and unyielding position that even the smallest movement is impossible. The mental anguish would be unbearable, and the physical toll would slowly grind away at the victim's resolve. Now let's shift to a form of punishment that's a little more publicly humiliating than torturous: the pillory. You might have seen it in old movies or history books, those wooden structures where the condemned were locked in place, often at the mercy of the public. But what you might not realize is just how agonizing the pillory could be. Public shaming was part of the punishment, but the physical discomfort of having your neck and wrists locked into place for hours, sometimes days, was enough to make anyone beg for mercy. This was no gentle, shame-on-you form of punishment. If you were locked into the pillory, you couldn't even stretch your neck or shift your body. People would throw rotten vegetables, excrement, or even worse at you. The effects were twofold. Your body was physically restricted, and your spirit was crushed under the weight of public humiliation. Some victims would suffer from the elements, standing in the hot sun, cold winds, or even rain. But the worst part? The sense of complete vulnerability, completely exposed to the taunts and jeers of the crowd. Historians argue whether it was more the public humiliation or the physical discomfort that made the pillory such an effective punishment. But one thing's for sure: this method of shaming didn't just break bodies, it broke spirits. At least with other forms of torture, like the scavenger's daughter or the Iron Maiden, the victim could be secluded, isolated from the crowd. But the pillory? Everyone saw you, and everyone got to judge you. It was a public reminder that crime didn't just affect you, it affected the community. And if that meant breaking someone in front of a cheering audience, then so be it. Now let's take a walk into the heart of medieval England, where the punishment for betrayal was swift and brutally theatrical. Drawing and quartering, the punishment reserved for those guilty of treason, was as graphic as it was horrific. The victim would be dragged through the streets, publicly humiliated, and then, depending on the king's whim, either hanged, drawn, or subjected to the most gruesome fate imaginable: quartering. This meant the victim's body would be tied to 4 horses, each pulling in a different direction until the body was torn apart. In the case of lesser executions such as hanging or decapitation, the victim might still find some form of mercy, but treason? Treason was a crime of such magnitude that it warranted a display that was meant to send a clear message. But how effective was this punishment? Historians still argue whether it was the immediate violence that struck fear into the hearts of the people, or the prolonged agony of seeing a person ripped apart that made drawing and quartering so effective. For centuries, this brutal punishment was considered a necessary deterrent. A traitor was not just executed, but made an example of. Nothing about their death was private or dignified. They were made to suffer and to be seen suffering by the entire town. The spectacle, combined with the grisly physical nature of the punishment, was meant to leave an indelible image in the public's mind, a stark reminder of the consequences of betraying the crown. As horrific as this may sound, it wasn't just about the body. there was something intrinsically psychological about this form of execution. It shattered the very concept of bodily integrity. The victim's identity, reduced to pieces scattered across the streets, left a terrifying image that served as a warning for anyone considering a similar fate. The lingering dread of being torn apart by horses, a fate so violent and final, was enough to ensure that even thinking about treason was more terrifying than the punishment itself. Now, if the thought of your body being ripped apart by horses didn't make your stomach churn enough, let's talk about a punishment that involved another twisted form of compression: the Spanish boot. This device was designed not just to punish but to break bones and render a victim completely incapacitated. A metal casing was placed over the leg, slowly tightened with a screw, crushing the bones and muscles inside. Unlike the quick nature of a decapitation, the Spanish boot was about prolonged pain and complete helplessness. Imagine the crushing weight of the boot slowly squeezing down on your leg, feeling the bones begin to splinter under the pressure. The pain was unbearable, yet no one could help you. Your fate was sealed by the slow, inevitable crushing of your body. Historians still debate how often the Spanish boot was used in medieval times. Some argue it was more of a threat than an actual practice, a tool for instilling fear rather than actual execution. Others believe it was used more frequently than records suggest. Regardless, the Spanish boot became a symbol of slow, agonizing punishment that haunted the minds of those who had to live under the shadow of such a fate. What makes the Spanish boot particularly disturbing is that it wasn't the type of punishment you could escape from. You could run, hide, or even beg, but there was no mercy from the iron boot. The slow press on your body would render you helpless to the torturer's will. It wasn't an immediate death, it was the lingering terror of feeling your bones breaking, 1 inch at a time. Now, picture yourself locked away in a cold, dark dungeon, shackled to the floor and awaiting your fate. The pillory might have been uncomfortable and degrading, but there were even worse fates awaiting those whose crimes were considered unforgivable, one of the worst being the rat torture. It wasn't enough to just put someone to death in the medieval era. No, for some, the punishment needed to be even more horrifying, more torturous, and it often involved animals. The concept behind rat torture was disturbingly simple, but equally terrifying. The victim would be locked into a small, confined space, often with just their torso or legs exposed. The torturer would then place a cage or container with rats on the victim's body and heat it up. The rats, desperate to escape, would begin to gnaw at the victim's flesh, burrowing into their body in an attempt to flee. There's something especially sinister about the idea of helplessly watching as rats gnaw at you, knowing there's no escape. While the specifics of how often it was used may be debated, the horror of this kind of torture has cemented it in history. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread method, or whether it was just a fantastical addition to stories told centuries later. Some believe it was a myth created by storytellers and chroniclers who wanted to embellish the already grim realities of medieval life. Others claim it was a real and cruel punishment employed by those with the power to make life unbearable for anyone who crossed them. Either way, it is a chilling thought. Trapped in a tiny cell, unable to escape, while rats feast on your body. The trauma would be mental as much as it was physical, and the aftermath would linger long after the pain had ended. But it wasn't just the rats that were the perpetrators of this grim fate. The medieval world had many twisted forms of punishment, and the Spanish boot was one of the cruelest. If you were unfortunate enough to face it, you'd find yourself enduring unimaginable pain as your body was crushed under a slow, steady pressure. The boot wasn't just for show, it was meant to break bones, incapacitate you, and force you into a state of total submission. The pain wouldn't stop until your body had been thoroughly crushed, leaving you helpless. The question remains, however, how often this particular form of punishment was actually used. Historians still disagree on its prevalence, some arguing that it was more of a myth or exaggerated legend than a common practice. But the idea of slowly squeezing someone's leg until their bones shattered is a terrifying thought, one that evokes the fear of being trapped in a situation from which there was no escape. Imagine that excruciatingly slow pressure building with every second, forcing your body to bend and break. There was no mercy in the Spanish boot, only a slow, agonizing surrender. Moving on from bone breaking, we come to the jug of water, one of the more sinister and psychological forms of punishment. This was a form of water torture that involved forcing a victim to drink large amounts of water until their body could no longer handle it. The medieval version often involved tying the victim to a chair or restraint, then forcefully making them drink until they could no longer breathe. The ultimate aim? To drown them in plain sight, to slowly suffocate their body with something as essential to life as water. The sensation of drowning is unbearable, and it was said that some victims would experience panic and terror long before the water suffocated them. Historians are still divided on how often this method was used, but it was one of those punishments that struck fear into the hearts of many. The idea that water, the very thing that sustains life, could be turned into an instrument of death was horrifying in itself. It wasn't just the drowning, though. The psychological toll of being forced to consume and inhale water until you were overwhelmed would have been far worse. It was a slow, agonizing method of torture designed to strip away any semblance of dignity or hope from the victim before death took them. With these various forms of medieval torture, it's clear that the line between punishment and psychological torment was often blurred. Whether it was being crushed by the Spanish boot, gnawed on by rats, or drowned in water, the medieval era had a terrifying way of breaking both the body and spirit. Oh, haunt! Now let's bring our focus back to the macabre, slow-moving tortures of the medieval world. Imagine, once again, being strapped to a chair, arms and legs locked in place, and there's no escape. You're caught, waiting for something that's not just physical but deeply psychological. You're about to face the strappado. This was a particularly brutal method of torture that involved tying the victim's hands behind their back and hoisting them into the air by a rope, often to the point where their feet barely touched the ground. The method was deceptively simple, but its consequences were horrific. When the victim was suspended in midair, their body weight would pull against their arms and shoulders, causing immense pain as the ligaments and tendons stretched. This wasn't just a form of physical punishment. It was meant to break the will of the individual. The strappado was designed to cause as much trauma as possible without permanent injury at first. Victims were often left suspended for long periods, sometimes with their hands bound so tightly that the circulation in their arms would be cut off. But it wasn't just the pain of being hoisted that made this method so brutal. Often, victims would be dropped or jerked down suddenly, a sharp tug of the rope causing their body to snap in ways that should never be natural. Historians argue whether this method was widely used in medieval torture chambers, or if it was an embellishment created by writers later on to heighten the terror of medieval punishments. Some records suggest the strappado was widely known as a method of obtaining confessions, while others claim that it was rarely used in practice. Regardless, imagining yourself suspended in the air, your arms screaming in agony, would make anyone question whether confessing was better than continuing to endure the excruciating pull. With that in mind, let's turn to another infamous punishment, one that's often more familiar to those who study medieval justice: the burning at the stake. This was the fate of those accused of witchcraft, heresy, or certain heinous crimes. The victim would be tied to a large wooden stake, surrounded by a pile of kindling. The fire was then set alight, and the condemned would burn alive. The horror of this execution wasn't just in the death itself, but in the anticipation, hearing the crackling of the fire before feeling the searing heat. Burning at the stake was a particularly horrifying punishment because it was both a death sentence and a public spectacle. The victim wasn't just killed, they were made to suffer in full view of the crowd. It wasn't a quick death either. The heat from the flames would first blister the skin, causing unimaginable pain. Then, as the body was consumed, the victim's organs would begin to fail. The final death would take time, agonizing, long minutes before the fire would finish its work. It would be fitful, and could take as many. Historians debate the true effectiveness of burning at the stake. Some argue it served as a grim lesson in justice, scaring others into compliance. Others believe it was a means to punish not only the body, but also the soul. The flames represented purification, a form of cleansing, and a permanent mark on the victim's reputation. For those accused of witchcraft or heresy, it was a fiery mark of their so-called sin. But one thing is clear: this form of punishment left scars that lasted far beyond death. The idea of being consumed by fire as a punishment for beliefs or actions strikes at the very core of human fear. It was a method designed to make an example of someone, to show the world that stepping outside of certain boundaries would be met with such brutal, fiery retribution. The public nature of it ensured that no one could forget the punishment. And what was the final mark of such punishments? The neck and dagger execution. This method was used in particular for enemies of the crown, the lesser criminals, and others who had earned the wrath of the authorities. The condemned would be forced to kneel, their neck exposed. A dagger would be thrust into their throat, severing the carotid artery in a swift, yet terrifyingly brutal move. The quickness of this method meant that death was almost immediate, but the idea of having your life extinguished by a sharp dagger at the hands of an executioner was a brutal reminder of the fragile nature of life. It wasn't the most public of executions, nor the most gruesome, but it was a reminder that sometimes the simplest tools, like a dagger, could be wielded to end a life in such a precise, unforgiving manner. Now that we've discussed some of the most infamous methods of medieval execution, let's take a look at a less immediately fatal form of punishment that still managed to leave a lasting impact: the flogging with the cat o' nine tails. This whip, named for the 9 knotted strands that made up its body, was a torturous tool used to beat victims into submission. Unlike some of the other methods we've talked about, the cat o' nine tails didn't always kill. But the pain? Oh, the pain was unbearable. It was a punishment meant to strip the victim of all dignity, to break their will through sheer physical agony. The whipping was typically done in public, where the victim would be lashed over and over, the sharp knots tearing into their flesh with each strike. The goal wasn't just to cause bruising, it was to tear the skin, sometimes so severely that the flesh was ripped away entirely. The cat o' nine tails was so effective that even if the victim survived, they'd be left with permanent scars. For some, the trauma of the experience would linger in the form of psychological damage long after their body healed. The mental toll of being publicly humiliated and beaten could break a person just as much as the physical pain could. Historians still debate whether flogging with the cat o' nine tails was as common as it's made out to be, but there's no doubt it was a very real and widespread form of punishment during the medieval period. The idea of being forced to endure this kind of brutal public humiliation was meant not only to punish the individual, but also to send a message to everyone who witnessed it. There was no escape from the public eye. Every crack of the whip was a reminder that the authorities had power over the body and the soul. And then, of course, there's the horrific thought of burning at the stake. This punishment was often reserved for those accused of witchcraft or heresy. Imagine being tied to a stake, surrounded by kindling and firewood, knowing that the flames would soon reach you. It wasn't just the act of being burned alive that made this punishment so horrifying. It was the idea that you could be consumed by fire, a living, breathing person, until nothing was left but ashes. The flames would scorch your skin, slowly burning away flesh and causing your insides to turn to mush. The smoke would fill your lungs, making it hard to breathe, You wouldn't die instantly, but rather suffer a long, agonizing death. Historians are divided over the exact number of people who were burned at the stake, but there are records suggesting that it was a relatively common form of punishment in the medieval period. The execution wasn't just for the accused, it was for the community. Those who gathered around the flames to watch weren't just witnessing a death, they were learning a lesson. It was a public display of power, a brutal warning that dissent and defiance would not be tolerated. The flames didn't just purify the body, they were meant to purify the soul and send a message to the entire town or city. Even though the flames would eventually consume the body, the legacy of the burning lingered far longer than any physical suffering. The burned victim became a symbol, a martyr, or a warning, depending on the circumstances. The fire didn't just burn flesh, it also burned into the collective memory of the people. They were meant to fear the flames as much as they feared the authorities who held the power to invoke such a death. And if burning wasn't enough, some criminals faced an even more tragic fate. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was a method of execution that was designed to break not just the body, but the spirit. The condemned person would be tied to a large wheel, with their limbs splayed out before the wheel was spun to ensure the person's bones were shattered, and they were left to die a slow, painful death. The spectacle of seeing a person twisted and broken on the wheel was horrifying enough to serve as a powerful deterrent to others who might consider committing the same crimes. Historians argue whether the breaking wheel was more of a public deterrent than a practical execution method, but its psychological impact was undeniable. To watch someone struggle in such agony, their body mangled and their life slipping away, was a reminder of the cost of defiance. Whether the wheel was used often or only in rare cases, it symbolized something that was common in medieval punishments, a brutal reminder that crime came at a severe cost. The breaking wheel wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was a spectacle meant to control the population. For a medieval society that often lacked other forms of effective law enforcement, public execution was an important tool for maintaining order. People needed to see the consequences of defying the rules, and nothing brought that home like the sight of someone broken on the wheel. Let's pause for a moment and imagine a time when even the smallest of transgressions could lead to the most horrifying, drawn-out punishments. You're locked away, shackled, and your fate is sealed, not with a single strike or quick death, but with a device so cruel in design it ensures your body is tortured for as long as possible. Enter the pair of anguish. The name alone sounds like something out of a nightmarish dream, doesn't it? This device was a metal instrument shaped like a pear, which could be inserted into a person's body. Yes, you read that correctly. The device would open up once inside, slowly expanding like a cruel, suffocating flower, causing unbearable pain as it stretched and compressed internal organs. If that wasn't enough, some versions of the pear also had spikes that would pierce the body's internal organs. Historians still argue whether the pair of anguish was ever widely used or if it was simply a terrifying legend that made its way into the folklore of the time. The stories are chilling though, painting vivid images of the device being used on those who were deemed unworthy of mercy. Whether it was used or not, the mere thought of such an instrument evokes feelings of helplessness and dread. Imagine being bound, unable to stop the excruciating sensation as the device opened up inside you, a slow, agonizing journey toward a merciful death. Moving on from the truly terrifying to the slightly less immediate but equally painful, we encounter the strappado once again, a method of torture designed to push the human body to its breaking point. Unlike the instant brutality of the neck and dagger or the fiery end of burning at the stake, the strappado involved a slow, unrelenting stretching of the limbs. Victims would have their arms bound behind them and then be hoisted up by a rope. The strain was enough to cause severe muscle and joint damage, often dislocating the arms entirely. This slow, methodical pain would continue until the victim either confessed or, in some cases, succumbed to the trauma. What makes the strappado especially disturbing isn't just the physical toll, it's the way it strips away a person's ability to resist. You're left dangling, completely vulnerable, with nothing to do but endure the endless suffering as your joints begin to pop and tear apart. Historians still argue over whether the strappado was as commonly used as accounts suggest, but one thing is clear: it was meant to break not only the body, but the spirit. The sheer helplessness of being trapped in such a vulnerable position, with no way to escape the agony, was enough to destroy anyone's will to resist. Then, we come to one of the more psychological forms of torture, the jug of water, not immediately fatal, but agonizing in its own right. This particular form of punishment involved forcing a victim to drink an excessive amount of water, and then making them wait until their body could no longer handle the pressure. The human body has its limits when it comes to water, and pushing someone past those limits could cause them to drown in their own fluids. To dive in and push in their body puts them within control over their own fluid. The process was horrifyingly slow, as the victim would be made to drink until their stomach stretched beyond capacity, creating intense physical discomfort, often followed by vomiting or even internal damage. This method of drowning didn't require a single drop of water from the outside. It was a form of torture that made the victim's own body turn against them. Historians still debate how widely used this form of water torture was, but one thing is clear: it was meant to create fear. The very idea of suffocating on your own fluids, feeling the pressure build within your body, unable to escape, is enough to make anyone's heart race. It's psychological warfare as much as it is physical. Was it about drowning the victim immediately? It was about making them experience the slow, suffocating process, feeling helpless as their own body began to betray them. Now, let's talk about a form of punishment that's often depicted in movies but is far more unsettling when you think about its practical application: the cat-o'-nine-tails. This weapon was designed to inflict pain in a manner that lasted long after the punishment was administered. It wasn't just a simple whipping. Each of the 9 tails of this brutal whip was knotted with small pieces of metal or bone, ensuring that each strike would tear into the flesh, causing deep, agonizing lacerations. It was more than just a beating. It was about ensuring the victim would remember the pain for as long as they lived. The cat-o'-nine-tails was used as a form of punishment, not only for criminals but also as a way to control the masses. Public flogging with this device served as a warning to others. The pain wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to ensure that the person never forgot the punishment. The scarring was a permanent reminder of what happened when someone crossed the line. And yet historians still argue whether it was more effective than other forms of punishment, or if it was simply a way to make people suffer without crossing the line into execution. With all these methods, one thing is certain: medieval punishments were not about quick, merciful deaths. They were about enduring pain, physical and psychological. The more prolonged the suffering, the more effective the punishment was seen to be. The purpose wasn't just to end life, it was to break the spirit, humiliate the body, and ensure that no one would forget the consequences of breaking the law. Imagine being trapped in a narrow, dark room, the air thick with dread, knowing that the very thing which sustains your life, breathing, is slowly being taken from you. One of the most insidious forms of punishment in medieval history involved something as simple and vital as air: the strappado, and more specifically the jug of water. While it may sound less dramatic compared to the fiery burning at the stake or the physical anguish of the breaking wheel, it was a form of psychological and physical torture that could make any victim wish for an end. In this form of water torture, a person would be forced to drink excessive amounts of water until their body could no longer manage it. Think about it. Your stomach feels as though it might explode, but the torturer isn't finished. They continue to push more, often until the person either vomited violently or, even worse, could no longer expel the liquid. If they couldn't vomit, the victim's body would begin to react in other ways. This method of punishment wasn't designed for a quick death, but for sheer torment. The sensation of drowning in one's own bodily fluids, feeling as though every breath might be your last, is nothing short of suffocating. It's slow, agonizing, and incredibly psychological. Historians still debate whether the jug-of-water torture was a widespread practice, or if it has become somewhat of a myth to further sensationalize the medieval era. Some believe it was rarely used because of its particular cruelty. The idea of forced consumption, water that should hydrate, but instead becomes the very thing to drown you, pushed the boundaries of what a human body could withstand. But even if it wasn't used often, the psychological impact of knowing it existed was enough to instill fear. If you thought that punishment was terrifying, imagine being forced into the Spanish boot. Unlike many other medieval tortures that involved chains or restraints, this method was meant to slowly, agonizingly, and relentlessly crush the bones. The victim's legs would be bound in an iron casing that was slowly tightened. Over time, the bones would begin to fracture, the nerves compressed until every movement felt like a shockwave of pain. The worst part? It wasn't instantaneous. This wasn't a quick and merciful punishment. The slow, gradual squeeze of the device meant the victim would experience prolonged agony, their legs growing weaker with each passing moment. What made the Spanish boot so horrifying was not just the initial pain, but the slow deterioration of the body that came with it. The pressure wouldn't stop until the victim could barely feel their limbs, and their mind would bend under the weight of the pain. Historians still argue whether this method was frequently used or just another dark legend passed down through the centuries. But regardless of its exact prevalence, the concept of having your body literally crushed under an unrelenting force is enough to send chills down anyone's spine. Meanwhile, while some victims were subjected to crushing or suffocating tortures, others faced more brutal public spectacles. One such infamous punishment was the pillory, an instrument of public humiliation designed not just to punish but to subject the condemned to ridicule and mockery by the public. This was a punishment meant for the lesser crimes, those that were seen as dishonorable but not punishable by death. The person's hands and head would be locked into the wooden contraption, leaving them utterly vulnerable to the mercy of the crowd. While this might sound like a relatively tame punishment compared to others on this list, the real horror of the pillory was the public nature of it. Victims were often left standing for hours, sometimes days, exposed to the elements, as a crowd gathered to mock and throw things at them. Rotten food, mud, or even worse was often hurled at the victim. While the pillory didn't inflict physical damage like the Spanish boot or strappado, it had a profound psychological impact. The person was not only physically constrained, but completely humiliated before the entire community. Historians still argue about the social effects of public punishments like the pillory. Some believe the punishment was meant to act as a public deterrent, a way to show others what happened when you broke the law. Others suggest that it had more lasting psychological effects than we often give credit for. The lasting impact of being publicly shamed, of losing one's dignity, might have been more effective than any physical punishment could be. The psychological trauma of that kind of public shaming, being turned into an object of ridicule, might have haunted the victim long after they were freed. Moving on from public shaming to another form of punishment that was deeply tied to public perception, burning at the stake. This was often reserved for those accused of witchcraft or heresy. The idea of being bound to a stake and consumed by flames may seem unimaginable, but for those in the medieval period, it was a very real fear. It wasn't just about the physical act of burning alive, it was about the condemnation of one's soul. The flames represented more than just fire. They symbolized the purification of the sinner's soul and the cleansing of the public mind. Historians debate whether burning at the stake was always effective in deterring crime, or if it was more of a political tool to silence dissent. The fear of being burned alive for believing differently is a terrifying thought, one that sent shockwaves throughout communities. But the burning didn't just end a life. It was meant to brand the accused as a heretic or witch for eternity. It wasn't just death, it was eternal disgrace. As we continue exploring the deepest and darkest corners of medieval punishments, it's hard not to think of just how creative the torturers and executioners were when it came to devising ways to make victims suffer. One such example is the rat torture, a method of punishment so horrifying that the mere thought of it is enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. Picture this. You're confined in a small, dark cage with no hope of escape. As a rodent feast begins, the rat torture was not just about physical agony, but about the psychological horror of knowing that the creatures around you were not only there to torment you, but also to feed on your body. The victim would be placed in a confined space with rats, often with their hands or legs bound so that they could not protect themselves. Then a metal or wooden cage containing hungry rats would be placed on their stomach or chest, where the rats, desperate to escape, would burrow into the person's flesh, gnawing and eating away at them. Imagine being unable to stop them, helpless to the gnawing, scurrying creatures that were eating you alive. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just an exaggerated tale. But the psychological trauma of such a fate would haunt anyone who was condemned to it. The rats didn't care who you were or what you had done. They were only driven by hunger, and they would stop at nothing to get to you. Some accounts even suggest that the torturers would heat up the cage to make the rats more frantic, increasing the suffering. Whether this was an exaggeration or reality, the horror of being eaten alive by animals is undeniable. It wasn't just the physical pain, but the complete loss of control over your own body that made the rat torture so horrific. But not all medieval punishments were designed to break the spirit through horror. Some were designed to break the body, like the Spanish boot. The concept of being slowly crushed inside a tight iron casing might seem unimaginable to modern minds, but this device was designed to do just that. The victim's leg would be inserted into a metal boot, which was then tightened with screws, gradually applying more and more pressure until the bones in the leg began to frack. The longer the boot was applied, the more agonizing the pain became. It wasn't just about the breaking of bones, though. It was about rendering the victim completely helpless. The Spanish boot was terrifying not only because of the physical pain it caused, but because of its slow, suffocating pace. The torment lasted for as long as the torturer wanted it to. Unlike quicker methods of execution, the victim knew that their suffering would be extended until the torturer decided it was over. Historians still debate whether this was a real and widely used torture method, or if it's simply another piece of medieval legend. However, the notion of being confined in such a brutal device, feeling your bones slowly break under pressure, is enough to make anyone's heart race. In stark contrast to the Spanish boot or the rat torture, some medieval punishments had a more visible and public flair, such as the pillory. Public humiliation was a key part of medieval justice, and the pillory was designed to ensure that the punishment wasn't just about pain, it was about shame in front of others. Imagine being locked in the pillory, your hands and neck tightly bound in wooden stocks, unable to move, while the crowd jeers at you, throws objects, and laughs. It wasn't about quick physical pain. It was about the slow and agonizing process of being stripped of your dignity. The mental suffering of knowing that you were at the mercy of the crowd was as powerful as the physical restraints themselves. But humiliation wasn't always the point. Sometimes, the punishment had a more direct goal: death in the most brutal manner possible. One such example is the breaking wheel, a method of execution that sought to break not just the body, but also the will. The condemned person would be bound to a wheel, their limbs spread out like the spokes of the wheel. Then, the executioners would smash the victim's limbs with blunt instruments, often breaking bones and leaving the person to suffer in agony before being left to die. In some cases, the victim would be left on display, serving as a grisly reminder to others of the consequences of breaking the law. Historians debate how frequently the breaking wheel was used. But there's no doubt that it was a terrifying punishment. The slow, excruciating pain, combined with the public spectacle of the execution, was designed to instill fear in the people. The message was clear: defy the law, and you too could end up as a mangled, broken body on the wheel. Moving on from the breaking wheel, we encounter another infamous medieval punishment, the Iron Maiden. While it's often depicted in popular culture, some historians question whether it was truly used during the medieval period, or if it was invented in later centuries to sensationalize the gruesome history of torture. Whether it was real or not, the idea behind the Iron Maiden is chilling. The device was essentially a metal coffin with sharp spikes on the inside. The victim would be placed inside and the door would close, slowly impaling them on the spikes. The design of the Iron Maiden is meant to cause prolonged suffering as the spikes pierced the body. Although some believe that the Iron Maiden was a fabrication, others argue that it might have been used in certain periods or regions, though less frequently than popular myths suggest. Regardless of whether it was used, the Iron Maiden became one of the most iconic symbols of medieval torture. The thought of being slowly impaled, feeling the cold metal press into your skin, is enough to send anyone's mind racing. As we drift further into the abyss of medieval tortures, we come across a method that makes the very idea of human suffering feel like it's being stretched to its limits: burning at the stake. This punishment wasn't just about death. It was about making an example of the condemned, leaving them as a burning, smoldering reminder of society's judgment. For those accused of crimes like heresy or witchcraft, the punishment could be a long, drawn-out affair, and it was as much about spectacle as it was about justice. When the condemned was tied to the stake, it wasn't just their body that would be consumed by the flames. It was their soul. The fire was meant to purify them, to destroy any remnants of sin or corruption that the authorities believed had overtaken the individual. The victim's body would slowly burn, their skin charred and blackened, while the crowd looked on in morbid fascination. Historians still debate whether this was done more for its intended psychological effect, scaring others into conformity, or whether it was the ultimate form of capital punishment, meant to be swift and final. Either way, it was clear that burning at the stake was an event that stripped the victim of their humanity. But what was so disturbing about burning wasn't just the physical death itself, it was the public nature of it. Burning alive wasn't just a punishment, it was a form of entertainment for the masses, a chance for them to witness justice in its most horrific form. Imagine standing in front of a roaring fire, the heat making your skin peel and blister as the crowd cheered or jeered. It wasn't just about death. It was about making the condemned an example for the entire community. Moving away from the flames, we come to another method of cruel and unusual punishment that was more about control than death. The breaking wheel, often seen as a symbol of total physical destruction, was used to leave the condemned not just broken in body, but also humiliated. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, their limbs splayed outwards, and executioners would strike them repeatedly with blunt instruments, often breaking the bones in multiple places. After the victim's bones were shattered, they would be left on display for hours, sometimes days, as a gruesome public warning to others. The breaking wheel wasn't always a form of immediate death. Sometimes, victims would be left to suffer in agony for an extended period, their bodies left exposed to the elements as they slowly succumbed to the trauma. Some were even left to die in the streets, publicly humiliated and tortured until their final moments. This was another form of punishment, meant not only to break the body but also to break the spirit of those watching, showing them that defying authority had consequences that might not come swiftly, but would certainly be horrifying. Historians debate whether the breaking wheel was as widespread as many imagine. Some scholars argue it was more of a symbolic punishment used in select cases, while others suggest it was a common and effective tool of medieval justice. The psychological impact of watching someone crushed under the weight of an enormous wheel is clear. For those who lived during this time, this wasn't just an execution, it was an event that marked the entire community. It wasn't just a punishment for the individual, it was a form of collective punishment, a reminder to all that they too could end up on the wheel if they didn't comply. Now, let's take a moment to consider the idea of punishment from a more psychological perspective. The strappata was one of the most insidious forms of medieval torture, not because it was necessarily the most physically damaging, but because of the uncertainty it imposed on the victim. Imagine being suspended by a rope, your arms pulled behind you as your body is left hanging in midair. The slow, aching pressure of your joints being stretched beyond their limits would quickly make you question whether you could hold out any longer. The agony of being left in this position wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. It was about leaving the victim trapped, knowing they could not escape their fate, and forcing them to experience the full brunt of their helplessness. Some accounts claim that the strappata would sometimes end with the victim being dropped suddenly, a sharp, painful jerk that would violently snap their shoulders or arms, adding to the intensity of the experience. For many, this torture didn't leave visible scars, but it left deep emotional scars that would last far longer than any physical injury. It was a method of breaking the will, not just the body. Historians still argue whether the strappata was as widely used as stories suggest, but one thing remains clear: the terror it inspired in those who faced it was very real. The idea of being suspended, vulnerable and helpless, is a terrifying thought. The strappata wasn't about the certainty of death, it was about the uncertainty of your fate. Would you be left to die slowly, or would your body be violently dropped to the ground, leaving you broken and unable to move? And for those who did survive, the mental and emotional toll could be even worse than the physical pain. The feeling of being completely helpless, of having no control over your body, is something that can break anyone's spirit. As we delve deeper into the unimaginable horrors of medieval punishments, let's talk about a method that, while relatively less known, struck fear into the hearts of the accused: the Spanish boot. This cruel device was used to crush the legs of the victim, rendering them helpless and broken. But unlike many other forms of torture that aimed for a quick death, the Spanish boot was designed for slow and agonizing suffering. A metal casing would be tightly applied to the leg, and the screws would slowly turn, tightening the casing and crushing the victim's leg beneath the unrelenting pressure. The real horror of the Spanish boot was its unyielding nature. The pressure didn't stop until the victim's bones were shattered, and often the suffering didn't end there. If the person survived the crushing pain, they would be left with permanent disabilities, their body forever marked by the cruelty of the executioners. But even beyond the physical damage, the psychological torment was enough to break anyone. Knowing that the pain would build and build, slowly, inevitably, was a mental battle that left its victims in a state of constant dread. Historians still argue about how frequently the Spanish boot was used. Some believe it was more of a rare form of punishment, while others argue it was a common tool of torture for those who had been condemned to an agonizing, prolonged death. Regardless, the idea of being bound in a device that slowly and relentlessly crushed your legs is terrifying enough to make anyone question the depths of medieval cruelty. On a similar note, another form of punishment that lasted far longer than it seemed necessary was the breaking wheel. While its name might suggest a simple form of execution, the process was far more gruesome. Imagine being tied to a giant wheel, your limbs splayed out like spokes, only to have your bones shattered with blunt instruments. The executioners would strike again and again until the victim's body was a mangled mess of broken limbs. The victim wasn't killed instantly. In fact, they would often be left on display for hours, sometimes days, to die a slow and painful death. While some might consider the breaking wheel a particularly brutal form of execution, it was more about public spectacle than efficiency. It wasn't just about killing the victim, it was about ensuring the entire community saw the consequences of defying authority. The sight of a broken, mutilated body on a wheel, left for all to see, was designed to strike fear into the hearts of those who witnessed it. Historians debate whether the breaking wheel was a commonly used method of execution or more of a rare spectacle reserved for the most heinous of criminals. What's clear, though, is that it was a slow, agonizing end that left a lasting psychological imprint on both the victim and the witnesses. At the same time, while public displays of punishment were meant to act as a warning, they were also a means of stripping away any sense of dignity the condemned person might have had left. Public humiliation was a powerful tool in medieval society, and methods like the pillory ensured that criminals would be subjected not just to physical pain, but to deep psychological suffering. The pillory wasn't just about locking someone in place for public ridicule. It was about stripping them of their humanity. The condemned person would have their head and hands locked into the wooden stocks, leaving them vulnerable to the public. Often they would be pelted with rotten food, thrown at bystanders, and forced to endure hours, even days, of humiliating abuse. The psychological toll of being mocked and humiliated in front of an audience was often far worse than the physical discomfort of being restrained. The pillory served as a constant reminder of the power of authority and the public's role in enforcing it. While historians debate the exact frequency with which the pillory was used, it was clear that it was a tool designed to make the punishment of the body secondary to the punishment of the spirit. The physical discomfort of being trapped was nothing compared to the humiliation of knowing that everyone around you saw you as nothing more than a criminal, someone undeserving of dignity or respect. In this way, the pillory was one of the most effective tools of psychological punishment in medieval history. If the pillory was about humiliation, burning at the stake was about making an eternal example of someone. The flames weren't just a punishment. They were a symbol of purification, cleansing the soul of those deemed unworthy by society. The condemned would be tied to a wooden stake, surrounded by wood, and set alight. The fire would consume their body, but the real torment came from the knowledge that death was not instant. The flames would scorch the skin, burn the flesh, and in many cases the victim would die from smoke inhalation long before they were fully consumed by the fire. Historians argue whether this was an effective form of punishment or merely a display of power. But one thing is certain. The fear of being burned at the stake was real, and it was designed to instill terror in the hearts of anyone who witnessed it. The flames were more than just physical. They were a permanent mark on the soul of the victim. This form of punishment was reserved for those accused of heresy or witchcraft. People whose beliefs or actions had so disturbed society that they were seen as threats that needed to be destroyed, body and soul. The psychological effect of burning at the stake was profound. It wasn't just about the physical agony. It was about making an example out of someone in the most horrifying public way possible. Even after death, the victim's body, consumed by fire, would remain a symbol of society's judgment. Continuing our journey through the most disturbing forms of medieval punishment, we reach one of the more infamous devices, the Iron Maiden. While often depicted in modern media, the historical reality of the Iron Maiden is still a subject of debate. Was it a real device, or was it an invention from later centuries, designed to emphasize the brutality of medieval torture? Regardless of its true origins, the Iron Maiden has become a symbol of the cruelty associated with medieval justice. Imagine being placed inside a coffin-like structure made of metal, the inside lined with sharp protruding spikes. The door would then close, trapping you inside, with the spikes driving into your body. The horror wasn't just the initial piercing of the skin, but the slow, agonizing death that would follow. The spikes were designed not to kill instantly, but to cause prolonged suffering. The Iron Maiden was a method of slow execution. Death would come, but it would be gradual. The body slowly impaled by the cruel spikes until the victims succumbed to their injuries. Historians still debate the authenticity of the Iron Maiden in medieval times. Some argue that the device was likely invented later, possibly in the 18th or 19th century, to exaggerate the horrors of medieval justice for sensational purposes. However, the concept of such a device fits well into the mindset of medieval executioners, who often devised methods that allowed for prolonged suffering and psychological torment before death. Whether or not the Iron Maiden was used during the medieval period, it remains one of the most iconic symbols of torture. Now, let's turn our attention to another form of torture that was not about public spectacle, but about enduring physical and psychological torment: the strappado. This device involved a victim being bound and hoisted into the air by their hands, often causing dislocation of the shoulders and severe joint damage. While not as publicly humiliating as being exposed in the pillory, the strappado was a form of punishment that tortured the body and mind in equal measure. The victim's arms were bound behind their back, and they would be hoisted into the air by a rope suspended by their own weight. The victim was left dangling in mid-air, unable to move, the weight of their body pulling on their arms and shoulders, stretching the muscles and ligaments to the breaking point. The agonizing pain would intensify with every moment they were left hanging. In some cases, the torturers would drop the victim suddenly, causing a brutal jolt that could dislocate joints or even break bones. This sudden movement, combined with the sustained torture, was meant to extract confessions or force the victim into submission. Historians still argue whether the strappado was as widely used as some records suggest. While it might not have been the most common form of torture, its psychological effect was undeniable. Imagine being helpless, suspended in mid-air, with the agonizing weight of your body tearing at your shoulders. The strappado wasn't about killing the victim. It was about breaking their will. The torment of being suspended, unable to escape, slowly destroyed the victim's sense of agency and self-control. Alongside the strappado and other physical punishments, there was a psychological element to many medieval tortures. One of the most feared methods was water torture, a form of torment where a victim was forced to drink excessive amounts of water until they could no longer physically tolerate it. Imagine being forced to drink beyond your limits, each gulp more agonizing than the last, until your stomach bloats, your body fights against what's being forced inside it. Water, the very thing we need to survive, becomes a tool of torment. This wasn't a quick death. It was a prolonged, agonizing struggle with your own body. Historians still debate whether this form of water torture was as prevalent as some records suggest. Some believe it was less common, perhaps used only in extreme cases, while others argue it was a regular form of punishment for those accused of crimes like heresy or treason. Regardless of how often it was used, the psychological terror of being forced to drink until your body could no longer cope with it is undeniable. The physical discomfort would have been unbearable, but the knowledge that your body could betray you, that you were at the mercy of something as essential as water, would have made it even more excruciating. Moving on from water to another method that instilled a sense of complete helplessness: the rat torture. The condemned would be locked in a small, confined space with rats, and a cage filled with hungry rats would be placed on the victim's body. The rats, desperate to escape, would gnaw at the victim's flesh, feeding on them as they were immobilized. The idea of being eaten alive by rats is a horrifying one, but it was also a psychological form of torture. The victim knew that they couldn't escape. They could only wait for the rats to finish their work. Historians still debate the exact origins of rat torture, whether it was a real method used widely in the medieval period or a more sensationalized tale. But the concept of being at the mercy of such small, seemingly insignificant creatures is terrifying. The victim's helplessness, combined with the gnawing of the rats, would have driven anyone to madness. As we approach the end of our journey through medieval tortures, we reflect on the methods that not only broke the body but also the spirit. Whether it was the slow, agonizing Spanish boot, the psychological trauma of the strappado, or the finality of burning at the stake. These punishments were designed to ensure that no one ever forgot the consequences of breaking the law. Medieval justice wasn't just about ending life, it was about creating an example that would haunt the living for generations. Now let's move to a punishment that was less about the immediate physical pain and more about the long-lasting trauma: the pillory. This form of punishment was less about death and more about humiliating the victim in front of the public eye. The person would be locked into a wooden frame, their neck and hands confined in a hole, leaving them completely exposed to the crowd. The idea behind the pillory was simple: public shaming. The victim's crime, whether it was something as minor as theft or something as serious as blasphemy, would be punished not by death, but by forcing them to endure the ridicule and scorn of the public. The physical discomfort of being trapped in the pillory was uncomfortable, to say the least. The victim's body would ache from being locked in place, and depending on how long they were left there, they could suffer from exposure to the elements. But the real punishment wasn't physical. It was the psychological torment of having everyone in the community see you as a criminal. It wasn't enough to be punished. You had to be seen being punished. For some, the experience of public humiliation would stay with them long after their release, and the fear of it could have been just as terrifying as the physical pain of more violent methods of punishment. Historians often argue whether the pillory was more of a deterrent or simply a form of entertainment for the crowd. Some believe it was designed as a public display to show others the consequences of wrongdoing. Others suggest that it was a way to keep the public entertained, feeding their appetite for spectacle and cruelty. Regardless, it wasn't just the victim who suffered. The entire community was part of the punishment. The crowd's jeers and mockery served as a reminder that lawlessness wouldn't be tolerated. Whether or not the pillory was effective in deterring crime is up for debate, but there's no doubt that it served as a chilling reminder of the power of public judgment. As we move from the psychological torment of the pillory to the slow, agonizing methods of death, we come to one of the most infamous: burning at the stake. Imagine being condemned for something as simple as a belief, a thought, or an accusation, something that many modern societies might dismiss as inconsequential. Yet, in medieval times, such acts could cost you your life, and burning at the stake was the horrific way your life would end. The victim would be tied to a large wooden stake, surrounded by kindling. Then, the flames would be set alight, and the person would burn alive. The flames would scorch the skin, boil the blood, and slowly consume the body. But it wasn't just the physical agony of being burned alive that made this punishment so terrifying. The burning at the stake wasn't about quick death, it was about creating an example for the community. The flames were meant to purify the soul, burning away sin and heresy. For those accused of witchcraft or heresy, this punishment wasn't just about ending their lives. It was about erasing everything they stood for. Their final moments weren't about dignity or mercy. They were about public humiliation, suffering, and fear. Historians often debate whether burning at the stake was a form of religious purification or a political tool used to control dissent. For some, the flames symbolized divine justice, purging the wicked from society. For others, it was a public spectacle designed to suppress anyone who might challenge the authority of the church or state. Either way, the burning at the stake left a permanent scar on society's collective memory. It wasn't just about the victim's death, it was about the message that no one could escape the judgment of the authorities. Moving from the fiery end to the slow and torturous demise that awaited some, we now come to another infamous method: the rack. The rack was a device used to stretch the body beyond its natural limits. The condemned person would be strapped to the device, and then the executioner would slowly pull the ropes, causing the body to stretch and dislocate. The victim's limbs, spine, and joints would be torn apart as the rack's tension continued to increase. This was not a quick death. It was a prolonged agony that could last for hours, sometimes even days. The rack wasn't just about causing physical pain. It was about breaking the will of the victim. Each pull on the ropes stretched the body further, making the victim feel as though they might be torn apart. The agony was so intense that many victims would confess to crimes they didn't commit, just to end the torment. Historians debate whether the rack was used as widely as legend suggests, but it is undeniably one of the most iconic symbols of medieval torture. It wasn't the quickest or most efficient way to kill someone. It was meant to break the spirit. While the rack may not have been the most common execution method, it served as a reminder of just how far medieval authorities were willing to go to ensure compliance. Torture was not just about punishing the body. It was about breaking the soul. The psychological torment of knowing that your body would be stretched until it snapped under the pressure was enough to break anyone. The rack wasn't just a device for physical suffering. It was a tool to destroy any sense of hope or dignity a person might have had left. And yet, despite all these agonizing forms of punishment, the fear of them often paled in comparison to the true terror faced by those accused of witchcraft or treason. The medieval period was a time when belief in the supernatural was as strong as the belief in justice itself. Witch hunts, fueled by fear, paranoia, and religious fervor, were responsible for countless innocent lives being lost. Women in particular were often accused of witchcraft, and once that accusation was made, there was little hope of survival. Historians still debate whether the widespread witch hunts were driven more by fear of the supernatural or by the political and religious agendas of the time. But one thing is certain: those accused of witchcraft were often subjected to the most horrendous and brutal punishments. Burning at the stake, torture, and even execution were common outcomes for those accused. The mere accusation was enough to condemn someone to a slow, agonizing death. The witch hunts were a dark chapter in medieval history, one that continues to haunt us to this day. As we delve deeper into the darker aspects of medieval punishments, we encounter one of the most notorious forms of torture ever devised: the Spanish boot. Imagine, if you will, being bound in a constricting metal casing that covers your leg. Slowly, the boot is tightened using screws, applying pressure to your bones, muscles, and joints, until the very sensation of your limbs becomes unbearable. The Spanish boot was a tool of relentless torment, meant not just to cause immediate agony, but to induce slow, excruciating pain as the bones in the leg cracked and splintered under the pressure. The worst part? It wasn't designed for swift death. No, the pain would build gradually, and death would come not as a quick release, but as a slow, agonizing end that would leave the victim broken and crippled. Historians debate how frequently this device was used, with some claiming it was a rare and particularly brutal punishment reserved for the most grievous crimes, while others suggest it was used more often in the public execution process. But, regardless of its frequency, the Spanish boot remains one of the most sinister examples of medieval torture. To be subjected to such a slow, methodical form of punishment, with no escape from the tightening pressure, was a horrifying fate that no one would wish upon themselves. The psychological terror behind the Spanish boot was almost as torturous as the physical pain itself. Imagine the knowledge that your body was being slowly crushed, the sensation of your leg breaking piece by piece, and the helplessness that came with it. The victim was rendered completely powerless, trapped in a device that could not be removed until the damage was done. There was no mercy, no escape, and for many, no hope of surviving it without lasting injury. And even if they did survive, the damage done to the body would be permanent, leaving them physically deformed and mentally scarred. Meanwhile, in the public arena, the breaking wheel served as another form of brutal spectacle, but it was a punishment of a very different nature. Unlike the Spanish boot, which focused on an individual's physical suffering over time, the breaking wheel was about making a statement, a horrific display for the entire town to witness. The condemned person would be tied to the wheel and often left to die slowly from broken bones and crushing injuries. The wheel itself, sometimes used in a symbolic or ceremonial way, was meant to be a grotesque reminder of the consequences of defying authority. When someone was condemned to the breaking wheel, it wasn't just about killing them. It was about ensuring the public understood the penalty for wrongdoing. The execution was meant to break the body, to fracture the limbs, and to inflict pain in the most visible and dramatic way possible. The victim would often be left exposed to the public for hours or days, not just as a punishment for the crime they had committed, but as a public lesson. The method was as psychological as it was physical. It wasn't enough to execute someone quietly. It had to be public, brutal, and terrifying, making the consequences of crime so clear that no one would dare challenge the law. Historians argue about the frequency of the breaking wheel and whether it was as widespread as we often think. Some believe it was reserved for traitors or criminals of particularly high profile, while others suggest that it was a common punishment for those who violated the most basic laws. Regardless, the spectacle of seeing a human being broken in such a grotesque manner was meant to serve as a lesson for all who saw it. To witness such a fate was a chilling reminder that, in the medieval world, the law could be a terrifying thing to cross. Now let's shift our focus to one of the most gruesome, yet oddly fascinating methods of medieval torture, the rat torture. While it may sound like something out of a twisted horror movie, it was a very real form of punishment, used to extract confessions or to ensure that the victim would not survive the ordeal. The victim would be placed in a small, confined space, sometimes with their arms and legs bound, while rats were placed in a cage against their body. The rats, desperate to escape, would gnaw and burrow into the victim's flesh. The pain was excruciating as the rats made their way through the body, feeding on the victim's flesh and organs. Historians still debate whether this method of punishment was actually used during the medieval period, or whether it has been exaggerated over time. Some believe it was an occasional form of torture, used in the most extreme cases where other methods had failed. Others argue that it is more folklore than fact, a gruesome tale invented to heighten the horror of medieval punishment. But regardless of its historical accuracy, the rat torture remains one of the most disturbing examples of human cruelty, highlighting the depths of despair that people were willing to subject others to in the name of justice. The psychological torment of rat torture was almost as unbearable as the physical pain. The victim had no control over the situation. They were at the mercy of the rats, with no way to stop them from burrowing into their body. The feeling of helplessness, combined with the gnawing and biting of the rats, created a truly terrifying ordeal. Even if the rats didn't cause immediate death, the mental trauma of knowing that you were being devoured alive would have been enough to drive anyone to madness. And yet, despite all these horrors, one of the most enduring images of medieval torture is the Iron Maiden. While historians still debate whether the device was used during the medieval period or was a later invention, its very design speaks volumes about the cruelty of the era. The Iron Maiden was a metal coffin with sharp spikes on the inside, designed to slowly impale the victim as they were locked inside. The spikes weren't meant to kill immediately. They were meant to cause suffering over time, slowly puncturing the body and allowing death to come slowly, agonizingly. Whether real or fictional, the Iron Maiden serves as the ultimate symbol of medieval torture, a device designed to cause slow, painful death, turning the human body into an instrument of torment. The idea of being trapped inside such a device, knowing that your fate was sealed, is a chilling thought. The psychological horror of knowing that death was imminent, but that it would be preceded by hours or days of agony, is enough to make anyone's blood run cold. As we arrive at the final chapter of our journey into the darkest corners of medieval punishments, let's turn our attention to the most psychological and drawn-out of tortures, the rack. This instrument of suffering was not only physically damaging but was also designed to torment the mind. Imagine yourself strapped to this device, each limb tied to a separate rope, each pulley slowly and methodically pulling your body in different directions. The tension grows with every turn, the victim's body stretched beyond its limits as their muscles strain, their joints dislocate, and their very bones threaten to snap under the pressure. It wasn't just about pain, it was about pushing the body to its absolute breaking point, until every movement was a war between survival and agony. The rack was a tool of control, not just over the body, but over the spirit. It didn't kill immediately. It didn't end things quickly. The point was to break the victim's will, to force them into a state of submission. People often confess under extreme pressure, and the rack was a tool for extracting confessions as well as for punishment. Historians argue that it was one of the most commonly used forms of medieval torture, and for a good reason. It was versatile. Not only could it be used to extract information, but it was also designed to humiliate, incapacitate, and inflict suffering without giving the victim an escape. While it is debated whether the rack was used consistently across all of Europe, it certainly represents the most basic human fear, the loss of control. The very idea of being strapped to a device, unable to move or escape, slowly feeling your body tear apart as the rack's tension intensifies, is the kind of psychological horror that resonates deeply. The rack wasn't just about killing, it was about breaking a person. Not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. It was a tool meant to strip away everything: dignity, resistance, and will. And when we consider public punishments, burning at the stake stands as one of the most horrifying methods ever conceived. While many of the punishments we've discussed were often carried out in secret, in dark, damp dungeons, burning at the stake was a public spectacle. An event designed to leave the entire community in fear. The flames of the fire were not just meant to consume the body, they were meant to erase the soul, purging anyone accused of witchcraft, heresy, or other so-called crimes from existence. Imagine the fear and horror of being surrounded by the crowd, the knowledge that flames would soon engulf your body, and that there would be no way to escape. Death by fire was neither quick nor merciful. The victim would first experience intense heat as the flames licked at their skin, then the unbearable pain of being burned alive. The victim might struggle, but there was no escape. The fire would eventually consume them, but it would take its time, slowly disintegrating flesh and causing immense suffering. Historians argue about the exact numbers of those who suffered this fate, but it's clear that this was a method of not just punishing the individual, but of making an example of them. The flames were meant to purify, to cleanse, and to ensure that no one could ever doubt the severity of the punishment. And even in the coldest depths of medieval justice, there were methods designed to crush the very bones of those condemned. The Spanish boot is a perfect example of this, a device meant to slowly crush the body's most essential structures. Once placed on the leg, the boot was tightened gradually, causing bones to crack and snap under the relentless pressure. The slow pace of the torture made it not only unbearable, but terrifying. With each turn of the screw, the pain intensified, and the victim was forced to endure until their body finally gave in. The idea of having your body slowly crushed, unable to escape, is a deeply horrifying thought. Whether it was used as frequently as historical records suggest remains unclear, but the Spanish boot has come to symbolize the ultimate in slow, agonizing torment. Though we have the psychological nature of punishment in the pillory, it wasn't just about being tied up in a wooden frame. It was about public humiliation, being exposed to the jeers and mockery of the crowd. Standing in the pillory, the condemned were not just physically restricted, but they were subjected to the scorn of everyone who saw them. The shame of being caught in such a position could scar a person for life. While physical pain was part of the punishment, the true horror lay in the loss of dignity, the feeling of being stripped of humanity and reduced to an object of ridicule. Many people, particularly in small communities, might have feared this punishment above all others. To be locked in the pillory was to lose one's standing in the world, to have your name and identity torn away, and to be reduced to nothing more than a criminal in the eyes of all who passed by. And even after being released, the stigma could linger long after the body healed from the physical pain. In a world where reputation meant everything, the pillory served as a constant reminder that social disgrace was perhaps the most terrifying consequence of all. In closing, the Iron Maiden, a device synonymous with medieval torture, remains a vivid symbol of human cruelty. Whether or not it was actually used in the medieval period is still debated, but its symbolic impact is undeniable. The Iron Maiden represented the very essence of medieval justice, a slow, painful, and agonizing death, designed to inflict not just physical damage, but also to completely degrade the human spirit, trapping a person in a metal coffin filled with sharp spikes and letting them slowly bleed out over time wasn't just about punishment. It was a tool of terror, meant to make the victim's death as horrific as possible. Historians argue whether the Iron Maiden was a real torture device used during medieval times or whether it was fabricated during later centuries. But the terrifying image of a person locked inside such a device continues to haunt our imaginations. Even if it wasn't used, it is a fitting representation of the lengths to which medieval justice would go to assert its power over the individual. And so, as we reflect on these punishments, whether real or exaggerated, we must remember that they represent a time in history where cruelty and torture were used as tools of control. These methods weren't just about extracting information or ending life. They were about instilling fear, breaking spirits, and ensuring that no one ever questioned the authority of those in power. But despite the horrors, we can also find a silver lining. These punishments eventually faded into history, replaced by more humane forms of justice. And while we may never fully understand the depths of suffering endured by those who lived through such times, we can look forward to a future where justice is no longer defined by fear, cruelty, or pain.